Brian Sloan had lived on the outskirts of Clearwater Ridge for over 15 years, tucked away in a modest, single-story house he had renovated himself over time. It wasn't the kind of property that made magazine covers or caught the eye of speculative buyers. It was quiet, practical, and entirely his. The land was deeper than wide, sloping gently toward a tree line that marked the rear boundary, beyond which sat nothing but unincorporated woodland. Years ago, when Brian purchased the property, he was told that the back third had an old municipal utility trench running through it, long decommissioned and irrelevant. It didn't bother him. If anything, it gave him peace of mind knowing no one would have a reason to encroach from the back. What mattered more to Brian was the workshop he built on that rear portion. It started as a rough-sawn shed with basic tools, but slowly evolved into a proper workspace. Insulated walls, reinforced flooring, and ventilation for varnishes and wood dust. The building was his livelihood, but also his retreat. While others found their routine in morning walks or television, Brian found his rhythm in dovetail joints and cedar grain. He specialized in custom-built wood furniture, not the kind you'd see at mass retailers, but pieces that took time, craft, and often several conversations with the client before the first board was ever cut. He didn't do flashy online marketing. His business grew from referrals, local builders, and a few steady contracts with regional suppliers, including the town's library, which had commissioned him for handcrafted reading tables just a month ago. The neighborhood had changed over the years. When Brian moved in, it was a collection of long-term residents, retirees, small business owners, and tradesmen like himself, people who mowed their own lawns and waved from porches but didn't pry. That equilibrium began to shift 5 years ago when a new wave of homeowners started buying into the area, younger families with money, often working remotely, bringing with them a different aesthetic and a stronger need for order. Property values had gone up, and with them came new expectations. Uniform fences, color-coordinated flower beds, curated landscaping. Brian kept to himself, mostly indifferent to the slow gentrification creeping down his street. But he noticed the glances, the occasional offhand comment about the shed out back that really ought to be updated. Then Karen Dorset arrived. She bought the house across the street last fall, mid-50s, divorced, well-dressed, the sort of woman who looked like she came from somewhere where people didn't apologize for correcting strangers. Within 2 months, she had organized weekly committee meetings, created a newsletter, and distributed flyers about preserving the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Where previous residents lived and let live, Karen established oversight. She wasn't malicious, at least not openly, but her tone always carried a quiet assertion of control. If she offered you a suggestion, it sounded like an instruction. If she thanked you, it felt like a warning. And when she smiled, it never quite reached her eyes. Brian had few interactions with her. When she introduced herself, he nodded politely, said he worked from home, and left it at that. She pressed a bit, asked what kind of work. "Carpentry," he said. She smiled as if amused by the simplicity of the word, and moved on. Later, he found a typed letter in his mailbox thanking him for being a part of our evolving community, and reminding all residents that any modifications or structural additions required advance notification to the local residential standards committee, a group Karen had recently formed and chaired. He ignored it. He had the permits filed years ago, approved by the city. His workshop was on record, his taxes were in order, and he had dealt with enough red tape in his life to know when a memo had no legal weight. Still, something in Karen's letter struck him as more than bureaucratic. It had a subtext of ownership, as if she believed the neighborhood belonged to her, or at least should look the way she wanted it to. Brian didn't see a reason to engage. He worked, paid his dues, didn't make noise, and didn't invite confrontation. But things didn't stay quiet for long. Around February, he noticed Karen spending more time outside, patrolling, some called it. She walked her dog in tighter loops, hovering near his property line, sometimes stopping to look at the side yard, or the stack of reclaimed wood he'd covered with a tarp behind the garage. She never said anything, but one afternoon he caught her taking a photo of his workshop from across the street. When their eyes met, she didn't flinch. She waved. The next week, he received a formal envelope in the mail, not handwritten this time, but stamped and sealed. Inside was a printed notice citing him for unauthorized storage of construction materials and visual obtrusion affecting neighborhood character. It came with a deadline. 2 weeks to remove or conceal the offending elements to preserve visual continuity. The notice bore the letterhead of the neighborhood committee, not a city department. It wasn't enforceable, but it was loud in intention. Brian didn't respond. He adjusted the tarp to make it neater, out of courtesy more than concession. He didn't want to give Karen the satisfaction of believing she had rattled him. But she wasn't just rattling. She was testing boundaries. And in March, she escalated. It started subtly. Complaints about noise. She claimed to hear power tools past quiet hours, even though Brian rarely worked in the evenings. Then came a call from the city inspector, saying there had been an anonymous report of industrial activity in a residential zone. The inspector, a weary-looking man in a city truck, apologized as soon as he stepped out. "Nothing personal," he said. "It's routine. We've had a few complaints, we check, we move on." Brian showed him the workshop, the permits, the license. Everything was in order. The inspector left with a shrug and a comment about how some people got too much time and too little patience, but Karen wasn't discouraged. If anything, her scrutiny deepened. When Brian delivered the finished library tables in late March and stored some leftover lumber near the workshop until it could be hauled, Karen sent a group email to several residents warning of unsightly wood piles and hazards to children. Brian received a copy from a neighbor who thought it was ridiculous but wanted him to be aware. He read it without surprise. Karen never addressed him directly, only through procedures, policies, or public messaging. Still, nothing suggested what came next. By early April, the weather had turned warm enough for Brian to begin preparing for summer work. He had a new commission lined up, his largest yet. A full interior refurnishing of a remote lodge near the coast. It would require weeks of prep, specialty woods, and an expanded tool setup. He had just finished ordering materials and was coordinating delivery schedules when he had to make an out-of-town run to pick up a rare batch of reclaimed maple from a supplier he trusted. He was gone less than 24 hours. When he returned, he noticed something strange from the moment he turned onto his street. The driveway was too clean. The backyard was too open. And when he stepped around the side of the house, the hollow in his chest dropped into his stomach. The workshop was gone. Not vandalized, not damaged. Gone. Where there had been a sturdy, weathered building with years of labor behind it, there was now a leveled square of dirt and gravel. The workbench, the lathe, the clamps, and saws, everything erased. A few splinters of board remained by the edge, some sawdust scattered like ashes. A construction cone sat near the back, and in the distance, 2 tire tracks led out toward the road. Brian didn't shout. He didn't cry. He stood still, staring at the space as though the act of looking could rewind time and restore what had been taken. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he walked toward the edge of the cleared lot and saw something that chilled him more than the demolition itself. A half-buried, exposed box near the utility trench, a tangle of fiber cables, cleanly sheared, and the unmistakable symbol of the local internet provider stamped onto the rusted access panel. He stepped back, mind racing, not toward anger, but calculation. This wasn't just his loss now. This wasn't just about him. It was going to unravel something much bigger. Brian didn't sleep that night. He sat in the living room with the lights off, the window open to the quiet hum of crickets and distant tires over gravel, trying to piece together the timeline in his head. It wasn't grief he felt, not yet. It was closer to a sharp, pressurized clarity, the kind that comes right before something snaps. The wreckage outside wasn't just about destroyed tools and lost income. It was about being erased without warning, about someone crossing a line and acting like it didn't even matter. He could still smell the dust in the air where his workshop used to stand, as if the wood hadn't had time to settle before it was hauled off. At first light, he walked the perimeter of the cleared space with a clipboard and camera in hand, documenting everything. He wasn't thinking about social media or public outrage. Brian wasn't wired that way. He was documenting for record, not reaction. He took photos of the torn earth, of the broken slab, of the frayed cables leading into the dirt. He dug down gently with a hand shovel and uncovered more of the bundle. Thick, fiber-wrapped wiring clearly connected to something below. It didn't take a telecom expert to know that what had been under his shop wasn't just some old utility remnant. These were modern lines. Leave, operational, and now severed. That explained the second thing he noticed the night before, after the initial shock had worn off. No internet. Not just at his house. The entire block was dead. No signal, no upload, no response from routers blinking in red confusion. He had thought it might be temporary, but now, standing in the morning sun looking at what was essentially the exposed spine of a network, he knew better. This was no temporary glitch. Someone had broken something vital, and no one had realized how vital until it was gone. His first call was to the internet provider. He bypassed the general support line and called the regional service center directly, a number he had saved years ago after a storm outage. He explained calmly and precisely that a demolition had taken place on his property without consent, and that during this action, a buried distribution node was damaged. He gave coordinates, described the damage, and offered to provide photos. The woman on the other end didn't sound panicked, but she asked him to stay on the line while she escalated the issue internally. Within 15 minutes, a technician supervisor was patched into the call. His voice was firmer, less customer service, and more logistical. "Mr. Sloan, did you say the node was beneath your workshop?" "Yes, the building sat over that area for years." "And when was it removed?" "Yesterday afternoon, without my authorization." There was a pause, and then, "We'll dispatch a crew." Do not attempt further excavation. This may be part of a priority backbone line. Thank you for calling this in. Brian hung up and immediately began writing down a formal timeline. He started with the first note from Karen, every complaint, every photograph he could remember her taking, and cross-referenced it with delivery logs and tool orders to prove when he had been using the space. At 9:30, a white utility van pulled into the street and parked 2 doors down. 3 technicians stepped out, all wearing reflective vests, and walked the length of the block with handheld scanners, stopping finally at the trench near Brian's lot. One of them crouched low, carefully brushing away debris from the severed cables. They didn't look at Brian, didn't ask questions. They were professionals doing damage assessment, and it didn't take long for their radio chatter to pick up urgency. By noon, 2 more trucks had arrived. One from the city's Public Works Department, the other unmarked but staffed by a man with a clipboard and a clear sense of authority. Brian walked over and introduced himself. The man looked up from his notes. "Are you the property owner?" "Yes, I'm the one who called this in." The man nodded once. "You were the only one who did." He didn't elaborate, but Brian could see the strain on his face. They knew this wasn't some casual issue. Losing a local node like this didn't just knock out Netflix. It stalled city data relays, medical alert systems, remote office access, and internal infrastructure tied to water management and emergency dispatch. And it had been destroyed because someone decided they didn't like the look of a workshop. Around 2, Brian received a knock on his door. A young city investigator, mid-30s and overdressed for a residential visit, stood on his porch with a folder under his arm. "Mr. Sloan, I need to ask a few questions about the structure that was removed from your backyard." Brian stepped aside and let him in, gesturing toward the dining table where he had already laid out documents. "Do you have any documentation proving the workshop's legality?" the investigator asked, pulling out a notepad. Brian pushed forward a copy of the original building permit, along with photos of its construction, electrical inspection sign-offs, and the most recent tax assessments that included the structure in property valuation. The man scanned through them. "Okay, and you weren't notified of the demolition?" "Not even a phone call." He nodded slowly. "We received a report that it was ordered by a community standards initiative. Apparently, they filed an emergency request under a city maintenance clause, which doesn't apply on private land unless there's imminent threat to public safety." "Yes, that's why I'm here." The investigator asked a few more questions, took photographs of the documents, and left. Brian watched him go, not with hope, but with anticipation. The system would move slowly, but it had started to turn. What had seemed like a personal violation was beginning to unravel into a procedural breach with consequences far beyond neighborhood aesthetics. But Karen, unsurprisingly, didn't see it that way. Later that evening, as Brian stood at the edge of the lot staring at the wreckage, she walked across the street carrying her dog in one arm and a glass of white wine in the other. She was smiling like it was a garden party. "Brian," she said, her voice lilting like she was speaking to a student, "I wanted to touch base about the workshop situation." He didn't answer. "I know it must be upsetting, but the committee determined it was really the best course. There were concerns." He looked at her silent. "Listen," she continued, "it's nothing personal. We're just trying to elevate the quality of the neighborhood. You understand, right? And besides, it wasn't even that nice a structure. I'm sure you can build something even better now, with proper input, of course." Brian stepped toward her, not threateningly, but deliberately. She took a half step back. "You leveled my property without permission, and you severed a live data line that was wired through the municipal grid." Karen blinked, smile faltering for the first time. "I'm not sure what you mean by that." "You'll find out soon enough." She scoffed and turned, walking away with the same artificial calm she always wore. But Brian knew that soon her version of control would start to slip. By the next morning, several city notices had gone out. The local medical alert network issued a bulletin acknowledging delays in system checks. The public library sent out a closure notice due to systems failure. And 2 parents in the area reported their remote working jobs had gone offline for hours. A neighbor down the street, usually quiet, left a note in Brian's mailbox. "I heard what happened. This wasn't right. Let me know if there's anything I can do. We relied on that connection for my wife's oxygen monitor." Brian read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it with the rest of his records. He wasn't alone anymore, and it was only just beginning. The following day began with the low rumble of heavy tires on asphalt, a sound that immediately set Brian on edge. He stepped out onto the porch to see a large utility truck parking 2 houses down, followed by a smaller city van emblazoned with the Municipal Engineering Department's insignia. 2 men in safety vests stepped out and immediately began surveying the sidewalk, pausing at each junction box and opening metal covers with long-handled tools. Brian didn't need to ask what they were looking for. The damage caused by the severed fiber lines beneath his former workshop had forced the city to trace the full span of the buried infrastructure. His call to the provider had triggered a chain reaction of inquiries, and now departments that had probably forgotten that portion of the network even existed were being forced to account for it. The city had long ago adopted a hybrid system of digital and physical relay points to support emergency services and older facilities, especially in the more remote neighborhoods. It was an aging architecture, patched and expanded over decades. Redundant in theory, it had become far more critical in practice than planners like to admit. Brian had known none of this before, but it was clear now from the expressions of the men outside, from their quiet exchanges and the repeated references to buried junctions not on the updated registry, that they had stumbled onto something structurally significant and dangerously fragile. As they worked, another vehicle arrived, this one a sleek silver SUV with tinted windows and a badge on the dashboard. A woman in a slate-gray suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, accompanied by an assistant who looked barely old enough to vote. She wore a badge from the city's legal compliance office and walked with the purposeful gait of someone both late and annoyed. She knocked on Brian's door without hesitation. "Mr. Sloan." He nodded. "I'm Valerie Drake, City Legal. I'd like to ask you a few questions regarding the demolition that occurred on your property 2 days ago." Brian let her in, guiding her to the dining table where his documents remained neatly arranged. Without waiting to sit, she opened her clipboard and removed a copy of the demolition order, which bore no city letterhead, just the logo of the neighborhood committee and a signature. "This is the only order that exists," she said, tapping the page with her pen. "There's no corresponding permit filed with the city for action on your property. According to our records, your workshop was registered and up to code. Was any notice served to you directly?" "No," Brian said. "No calls, no letters. I came home and it was gone." She didn't react emotionally. She wasn't here to sympathize. She was there to assess exposure. "Were you made aware at any point that community members were discussing the removal of your structure?" "Only in vague terms. Complaints from one neighbor, but nothing that implied legal action was imminent." Valerie jotted something down. "Do you know the identity of the person who signed this?" Brian leaned in. "That's Karen Dorset." "She has no legal standing to authorize demolition," Valerie said flatly. "Not without court approval or immediate hazard designation backed by certified inspection." Brian opened a folder and handed her his copy of the inspection report from last year. It showed a fully compliant electrical system, a sealed dust extractor, and reinforced joints rated for storm conditions. She read it quickly and added it to her pile. "We'll need to move quickly on this. Damage to municipal infrastructure complicates things. The city will likely treat the incident as an unauthorized interference with public utility systems." She turned to leave, but paused. "You'll be contacted by outside investigators. I advise you to document everything, but avoid engaging with the committee members for now. Let the city handle contact." As she left, Brian's eyes followed the engineers on the street. They had opened another panel and were shaking their heads, talking in low tones. By mid-afternoon, he received an official letter from the city's infrastructure division confirming that an emergency override had been issued for the area. Technicians would be working to restore full functionality over the next 10 days. All affected residents had been notified. A temporary mobile relay truck was deployed and parked at the edge of the block to maintain baseline service, but the disruption remained significant. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the pavement, a group of neighbors gathered near the corner. It wasn't a protest or a meeting, just a group of frustrated people trying to understand what had gone wrong. Brian stayed at a distance, not eager to be the focal point, but he could hear snippets of conversation. A man in his 50s complained that he hadn't been able to access medical records for his father's treatment. A young mother said her daughter's virtual tutoring sessions had crashed mid-lesson and the tutor refused to reschedule. Another man muttered about losing access to cloud-based data for work and nearly missing a project deadline. Then someone brought up Karen. "She said it was a fire hazard," a woman said, "that he had no right to be running a business out of that thing." "That's not what the inspector said," replied another voice. "He was legal. Everything was registered." "Well, then why'd she—" "Because she doesn't like the way it looked," a third voice interrupted. Brian didn't move, didn't speak, but he could feel the current shifting. Karen had overplayed her hand, and the neighborhood was starting to recognize it. The next morning, a formal investigation was opened by the city. Brian received confirmation via email and a letter hand-delivered by courier. The investigation would include interviews, document reviews, and cross-referencing demolition orders with legal mandates. He wasn't required to participate beyond his statement unless subpoenaed. That was fine by him. He had no interest in turning the ordeal into a performance. He wanted accountability, not attention. But Karen wasn't ready to yield. The following evening, he found a fresh notice taped to his front door. It was another committee memo, unsigned but clearly authored by her, accusing him of contributing to the disruption and distress currently impacting our community. It alleged that his use of unapproved equipment and excessive electrical draw may have interfered with nearby systems and called for a broader review of private workshops operated on residential lots. It was laughably transparent, a last-ditch effort to shift blame. He didn't respond. Instead, he contacted a local attorney specializing in property law and municipal disputes. She met with him the next day and reviewed everything: permits, photographs, notices, even the torn remains of the workshop's concrete foundation. She confirmed what he already knew. The committee had zero jurisdiction over demolition actions. Worse, their actions now opened them to civil liability not only from him, but from every resident affected by the outage. If the city proceeded with a formal finding of unlawful interference, class action suits could follow. That afternoon, Brian received an unexpected visitor, a man named Glenn, who lived several houses away. He was older, soft-spoken, and had rarely exchanged more than a wave with Brian before. Now he stood at the door with a folded map and an apologetic expression. "I thought you should see this," he said, handing over the paper. "Karen's been using it in meetings. She says it shows how the area was originally zoned for residential continuity. Claims your structure violates that." Brian unfolded the map. It was a decade old, hand-marked and inaccurate. The property lines were off by several feet, but more importantly, it bore no official seal, no signature, no legal standing whatsoever. "She's passing this off as legal documentation?" Brian asked. Glenn nodded. Some folks believed her. Until now. That evening, as the mobile relay unit hummed softly from the far end of the street and the last rays of light filtered through the trees, Brian walked his lot again. The damage was no longer just personal. His loss had exposed the neighborhood's reliance on infrastructure no one had maintained properly or even remembered existed. It had revealed how shallow bureaucratic power could become when exercised without accountability. And it had shown his neighbors something they hadn't wanted to admit: that one person's obsession with control could quietly erode the fabric of a community more than any cluttered workshop or stack of lumber ever could. He stood where the entrance to the workshop used to be and stared into the dirt. The cables had been covered again, now roped off with red tape and warning markers. The foundation was cracked but still visible, an outline of what had been. But he wasn't looking at what was lost anymore. He was already thinking about what came next. Not revenge, not defiance, just a restoration of balance, done properly, through the right channels, and with the same steady patience he brought to every joint he had ever cut, every piece he had ever sanded to silence. Because if there was one thing Brian Sloan understood better than anyone, it was how to rebuild from the ground up, and how to make sure the next version couldn't be taken down so easily. The following week unfolded with a strange combination of stillness and undercurrent. On the surface, the neighborhood appeared to resume its usual rhythm: cars backing out of driveways, sprinklers hissing in rotation, children riding bikes in lazy loops around the cul-de-sac. But beneath that normalcy was a brittle tension, a collective waiting for something to shift. Brian kept his routine tight and deliberate. He worked from his garage now, improvising with limited tools, salvaging what he could from the remnants of his demolished workshop. But more than work, he focused on precision, cataloging correspondence, organizing permit files, printing backup copies of every city communication, every legal notice and inspection form, making sure that if the ground shifted again, he'd be ready to stand firm on something solid. The temporary internet relay truck parked at the edge of the neighborhood remained in place, humming softly throughout the day. It was an ever-present reminder that the damage caused by the demolition had not been minor, and that the old system had been a load-bearing piece of forgotten infrastructure. Restoration wasn't a matter of reconnecting a few lines. It required rerouting, excavation, inspection, and coordination across departments that normally operated in isolation from one another. The city had issued an official bulletin confirming the node destroyed on Brian's property was part of a legacy system, still used to bridge data flow between modernized service zones. That node had carried both high-priority municipal traffic and low-level redundancy, emails, telemetry, encrypted communications used by utilities, and automated alerts tied to local infrastructure. Cutting it had caused not only residential outages but disruption in citywide synchronization protocols, some of which were tied to public safety platforms. Brian didn't pretend to understand all the technical layers, but he did understand weight. He understood what happened when a structure, physical, procedural, or political, lost a piece of itself and suddenly had to bear more than it was built for. That's what was happening now. The city wasn't angry at him. If anything, they were embarrassed. Their own systems had failed to account for what had still been operational. The silence from Karen's committee, however, was a different story. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was damage control. 2 nights later, Brian was reading through another copy of the incident report when he received a call from his attorney, Dana. Her voice was clipped, purposeful. "I thought you should know. There's been movement." "What kind?" A formal complaint was filed against the committee by the city's risk management office. Not against individuals yet, but they've opened an internal process to determine who authorized what. Brian absorbed the words slowly. "It also means," she continued, "that any statements made going forward could become part of discovery if this moves toward litigation." "Do I need to prepare anything new?" "Not yet. You've already done more than most clients ever do. Just keep your records clean and stay calm." But something else came across my desk, a file from the Building Oversight Board, flagged for review. It contains a letter from the contractor that performed the demolition. It says they received direction to proceed under verbal authorization. No written order, no inspection clearance. So they were working blind. They were working off an assumption of authority. That's dangerous. Does the contractor name Karen directly? No. But the supervisor logged a name. Dorset. That's enough to start a trail. Brian thanked her and hung up, feeling the weight of confirmation settle in his chest. It wasn't that he needed to be right, but he needed the truth to stop being treated as negotiable. That same evening, around 8, he heard a knock on the door. It wasn't the sharp, officious rap of a bureaucrat or a neighbor's hesitant shuffle. It was deliberate, measured. When he opened it, he saw an older man, late 60s, tall, lean, in a well-worn field jacket. His name was Marvin, a resident from 2 streets over. Brian had seen him at a few block events years ago but never exchanged more than a few polite words. Marvin held out a folded envelope. "I think you might want this," he said, his voice flat but not unfriendly. Brian opened it and found a copy of a letter Karen had circulated to a smaller internal list. A message not shared with the wider committee or neighborhood, but one that clearly showed she had pushed for urgent action regarding the structure on Brian's property. It didn't say demolish, but it implied it, strongly, in phrases like immediate correction of non-conforming elements and contractor engagement pending verbal confirmation. It was dated 3 days before the demolition. The distribution list was handwritten at the bottom. Marvin's name was on it. "I didn't agree with it then," he said quietly. "But I didn't push back. I thought someone else would stop her." "You're stopping her now," Brian said. Marvin nodded once. "Don't let this slide." The next morning, Brian walked the lot again and noticed something small but unmistakable. A city inspector's flag, bright orange, staked at the edge of the trench. Next to it was a marker indicating buried fiber. Restoration was officially underway, but the path to that point had passed through layers of failure: bureaucratic, personal, structural. It wasn't just a matter of rebuilding. It was a matter of recognizing how easily bad decisions, wrapped in process and good intentions, could collapse what others had taken years to build. He thought of Karen. Not with anger, but with a strange clarity. She had treated the neighborhood like a showroom. Every deviation, every imperfection was an offense. And like many people who confused order with control, she had believed that removing what didn't match was not just justified, but virtuous. What she didn't understand, and perhaps never would, was that real communities aren't designed. They're built. One compromise at a time, one shared inconvenience at a time, one unspoken tolerance after another. But the real midpoint wasn't her mistake. It was the consequence she didn't see coming, that by attacking what she didn't value, she exposed what everyone else relied on. She had triggered a systems audit of the entire block, every line, every relay, every oversight, and in that spotlight her power began to shrink. For the first time since the incident, Brian didn't feel like a target. He felt like a reference point, like the coordinates others were now using to fix their direction. And though the full reckoning hadn't arrived yet, he could hear it coming, like distant thunder rolling over dry land. By the end of the second week, whatever facade of calm had blanketed the neighborhood began to unravel. Not all at once, not with shouting matches or visible confrontation, but with the quiet uncoiling of trust. People who had once nodded politely at block parties now avoided eye contact in driveways. The daily routines carried on. Trash bins wheeled to the curb, sprinklers ticking in their rhythm, mail collected. But the air was different. Tension no longer lingered in private. It hovered between households, among neighbors forced to confront what they had ignored for too long. Karen Dorset, once the confident face of local organization and community vision, had gone quiet. Not publicly, but tactically. She had retreated from her usual morning walks and had not sent out a newsletter since the city began its investigation. But the silence wasn't safety. It was a gap being filled by other voices. It started when several residents received formal letters from their service providers, not as a courtesy but as declarations of failure. The prolonged network outage that had originated from the unlawful destruction of infrastructure had been classified as a disruption event. For one couple, it had meant the loss of live monitoring for a chronically ill parent. For a software contractor, it meant 2 missed deadlines, penalty clauses invoked, and a client who chose not to renew. Brian didn't ask for these stories. They came to him uninvited, slipped under his door, murmured from porches, sent in quiet emails from personal addresses. The damage had gone beyond him. What had started as a personal loss was now a collective breach, and in that collective awareness, a slow groundswell began to form. The real shift came when a notice arrived from the legal office of the Municipal Communications Authority. It was not addressed solely to Brian, but to several residents, including Karen. It informed them that the incident involving the unauthorized demolition of private property resulting in the severance of active municipal communications hardware had triggered a breach report. As a result, the city was now formally engaging with the contractor, the neighborhood committee, and all parties named in the complaint to determine liability for damages totaling an estimated $84,000. While the city was not yet naming individuals publicly, the implication was clear. Those responsible would be held accountable not only administratively, but financially. For Brian, it was a validation, cold and procedural, but nonetheless real. Karen, however, responded exactly as he anticipated. Not with contrition, not with silence, but with diversion. Within 3 days of the notice, a new flyer appeared on several doorsteps. Not in mailboxes, not hand-delivered, but tucked beneath welcome mats or wedged into planters, deliberately casual, like a forgotten invitation. It bore no letterhead, but the language was unmistakable. It was a call to reevaluate the compatibility of private industrial structures with the values and aesthetics of our residential space. A veiled attempt to redirect blame away from her and onto Brian once more. Oh. The paper cited unregulated electrical activity, risk of soil instability, and visual degradation of property values. Nowhere did it mention the city's investigation, the formal permits Brian held, or the critical infrastructure that had been destroyed. It was damage control through misdirection, and it didn't land the way she had hoped. This time, the pushback came not just from whispers, but from open objection. A neighbor named Harold, who had lived 2 houses down from Brian for over a decade, took a photo of the flyer and posted it on a local forum, attaching a scathing comment. She calls it an eyesore. I call it the only place in this neighborhood where something useful got built. Within hours, the post had dozens of replies, some angry, some sarcastic, but nearly all unified in tone. People were tired of being managed under the guise of unity. Karen had turned her position into a cudgel, and now that her actions had consequences, she was trying to disappear behind procedural language and cosmetic concerns. But words were no longer enough, on either side. A week later, Brian was served. The courier handed him the envelope with a neutral expression, clearly not interested in the contents. Inside was a formal complaint. Karen Dorset was suing Brian for defamation, for intentional distress, and for reckless disregard for communal well-being. The language was surreal. It accused him of manufacturing outrage, of tampering with utility records, and of deliberately manipulating community opinion to smear her character. She claimed she had merely followed agreed-upon neighborhood priorities and was now the victim of a calculated campaign of vilification. Brian stood in his kitchen, holding the papers in his hand. Not angry, but stunned at the audacity. He called Dana immediately and scanned her the documents. "She's trying to preemptively insulate herself," Dana said after reviewing the complaint. "By going on offense, she's hoping to reframe the narrative. But this isn't a defamation case. This is a smokescreen." "Do I have to respond?" "You will, but we'll file for dismissal with prejudice. Her suit is reactive. It won't hold up." Still, the psychological effect was not nothing. The idea that Karen had now formalized her delusions into legal language, that she was willing to weaponize the court system to muddy the waters, was an escalation Brian hadn't wanted, but would now be forced to meet. It wasn't about the workshop anymore. It wasn't even about the outage. It was about truth being bent until it no longer resembled anything recognizable. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. The contractor involved in the demolition was subpoenaed for documentation, and it was there that the cracks began to widen. Under pressure, the supervisor admitted that they had acted under informal direction, without checking for underground infrastructure or verifying city clearance. The person who had given them that direction? Karen Dorset. Her name appeared in internal communication logs, in calendar notes, and, fatally, in an email with the subject line, "Urgent Site Correction, Dorset." The city moved swiftly after that. Karen was officially named in the liability review. Her assets were flagged for potential claims, and for the first time since the demolition, she came to Brian's property not with a smirk, not with condescension, but with a kind of tight-lipped urgency. He was in the garage when he heard her voice. "Brian." He stepped out, wiping his hands. "I don't want this to escalate further," she said, arms crossed, tone clipped. "I think we both want this to end." "You think I filed the city complaint?" "No," she said. "But you didn't stop it." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I couldn't have stopped it if I wanted to. You severed a critical node. People lost access to medical systems. You didn't just damage my workshop. You damaged their lives." "I didn't know," she said quietly. "You didn't ask." She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked back toward her house, her stride slower, the straightness of her back faltering ever so slightly. It wasn't defeat. Not yet. But it was the beginning of recognition. The following week brought more fallout. The city announced that all community-initiated structural alterations within city limits would now require triple sign-off: municipal review, property owner consent, and independent hazard assessment. It was a bureaucratic clampdown in response to what had happened, and though it would slow development, most residents welcomed it. Better slow than reckless. Better thorough than blind. Brian continued documenting, responding to legal filings, and meeting with the restoration crew that had begun relaying fiber beneath his yard. They worked carefully, respectfully, sometimes asking for input, sometimes just offering quiet nods of understanding. One of them, a young technician named Marcus, said something on the second day that stuck with Brian. "You'd be surprised how often things stay standing not because of planning, but because no one thought to tear them down." He smiled at that, the truth of it deep and sad. By month's end, the workshop wasn't back, but the outline was marked in chalk, the new slab was poured, and the materials were ordered. The lawsuit from Karen was dismissed before it reached a hearing. The city issued a formal statement acknowledging Brian's cooperation during the investigation and his role in preserving evidence. Karen, in turn, received a fine. Not massive, not ruinous, but enough to sting, and to confirm in writing that her actions had not been procedural, but personal. The neighborhood didn't celebrate. They didn't organize a block party or send him flowers. But people waved more. They nodded. They started conversations instead of ending them quickly. One morning, Brian found a package on his porch. No note, just a box of fine wood chisels, new and unused. He never found out who sent it. And as the foundation cured beneath the spring sun, as the cables beneath it were buried in new shielding and marked with bright orange flags, Brian stood at the edge of his lot and felt something he hadn't in weeks. Not victory, not vindication, but clarity. The worst part wasn't that someone tried to take what he had built. The worst part was how easily it almost worked. And now that it hadn't, the rebuild would be different. Not just stronger, but smarter. The kind of structure no one would take lightly again. By the third month, the neighborhood had become quieter in a way Brian hadn't expected. Not from fear or suppression, but from fatigue. The storm had passed, though debris still lingered in the form of broken relationships, unspoken resentments, and awkward pauses where friendly conversation used to live. The community had been forced into a confrontation it never asked for, and though no one spoke about it directly, the shape of what had happened hung in the air like a permanent fixture. The mobile relay truck had long since been removed. The node beneath Brian's property had been rebuilt with updated shielding, and a new utility access hatch now sat embedded in the concrete slab where the workshop's foundation had been recast. The slab itself was wider, thicker, and reinforced to meet new city standards, but for Brian it felt heavier in other ways. A weight of memory, of loss, of everything that had to be learned the hard way. Karen Dorset no longer walked the neighborhood. Her SUV remained parked in the same position for days at a time, and the once meticulously trimmed hedges that bordered her property had grown uneven, a faint but visible collapse of control. She had retained counsel in response to the city's fine, but her attempt to shift blame onto the contractor had fallen apart when communications surfaced that clearly showed her as the initiating party. More damaging still was the deposition from the contractor's supervisor, who testified, under oath, that Karen had stated explicitly, "The city is on board, just get it done before the weekend." That sentence, recorded in an internal project memo and confirmed by 2 additional employees, stripped her of any pretense that she had simply misunderstood a process. She had overstepped, misrepresented, and bulldozed both literally and figuratively, believing she would never be challenged. Brian's workshop had now entered a new phase, not in construction, but in context. What had once been a personal workspace, a private sanctum for his craft, was now also a legal symbol. Its reconstruction had been partially funded through a city mitigation program, a rare acknowledgement of municipal failure to enforce procedural boundaries. In an even more unusual move, the regional provider had offered Brian a small operations contract, consulting on neighborhood-scale service vulnerability assessments, using his property as a case study in infrastructural negligence. It wasn't glamorous work, and Brian didn't seek attention for it, but it added another layer to his identity in the eyes of the city. Not a victim, but a participant in systemic correction. Still, none of it replaced what had been lost. The original workshop had been more than lumber and nails. It had been a vessel of time, of work done under quiet morning light, of tools passed down and worn into habit. The new version would serve its function, but the soul of it had been scorched out with the dust. Then came the hearing. It wasn't criminal. The city had declined to pursue formal charges, opting instead for administrative penalties and civil restitution channels. But the hearing was public, and it mattered, not for punishment, but for record. Brian had been subpoenaed as a witness, not a complainant. He wore a simple jacket and sat quietly at the rear of the chamber until called. The room wasn't full, but a handful of local residents were present, including 2 from the committee that Karen once led. Karen sat at the opposite table, flanked by a lawyer and a stack of folders she barely touched. Her face remained fixed in a neutral expression, but Brian could see the rigidity in her posture, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table just a little too tightly. When it was his turn, he was sworn in and asked to recount the events as he knew them. He spoke plainly. No embellishments, no dramatics. He described the permits, the years of operation, the absence of notification, the return to find his workshop destroyed. He described the exposed node, the outage, the technician's response, the letters from neighbors. He spoke of what had not been said, the assumption that someone like Karen could act without consequence because people like him usually didn't fight back. Then the panel asked one final question. "What would you like to see as a resolution?" He paused. "I don't need repayment," he said. "Not really. Most of that damage is already done. But I think there needs to be recognition, publicly, that people don't lose rights just because someone else doesn't like how something looks. We're all responsible for what we build. We should be just as responsible for what we tear down." There was a stillness afterward, not out of awe but out of weight. The panel nodded, thanked him, and released him. He walked past Karen on his way out and felt no surge of anger, no satisfaction. Just a quiet, final confirmation that he had done everything he could within the system he still believed had value. The ruling came a week later. Karen was officially censured by the city's administrative board for misrepresentation and unauthorized initiation of infrastructure impacting actions. She was fined $24,000, ordered to provide written apologies to affected households, and barred from holding any position of residential authority or representation for a period of 5 years. The fine wasn't crushing. She could afford it. But the public nature of the censure, the formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, was irreversible. Her name was no longer spoken with admiration or respect. It was avoided. A cautionary tale. Brian received his notice by mail, and he read it in silence. There was no urge to celebrate. Justice, when it finally comes, doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like an exhale. A week later, the first delivery for the new workshop arrived. He stood in the driveway and watched as the truck backed in, slowly, carefully, and lowered a fresh bundle of treated beams to the gravel pad. The sun was rising behind the trees, casting long shadows over the ground. The same ground where everything had started, and now would start again. And this time, the foundation would hold. The summer settled over Clearwater Ridge with a kind of thick, resigned stillness, the kind that follows upheaval but doesn't quite forget it. Lawns were cut, but less precisely. Block events resumed, but with fewer RSVPs, and conversations between neighbors became shorter, more functional. The neighborhood had aged in a matter of months, not in years or appearances, but in its collective temperament. There was caution now, an awareness that what had once been taken for granted could be disrupted by a single person's unchecked will. Karen Dorset's house sat unchanged on the outside, but its aura had curdled. Her once reliable routines vanished, and the woman who once dictated visual standards to others now let her paint peel and her hedges grow dull. No one knocked on her door, no one asked her opinion, and no one invited her to the seasonal meetings that quietly resumed under new informal leadership. She was not officially shunned, but silence worked faster than confrontation ever could. Across the street, Brian's new workshop began to take shape, not hurriedly or under the pressure of deadlines, but with the deliberate rhythm of someone reclaiming space on his own terms. He didn't rush the construction. He did it piece by piece, section by section, working in the early mornings and quiet evenings, fitting in moments of calm between deliveries, finishing the framing with local help he trusted, and wiring the new electrical lines with a licensed friend, who offered to work at cost. The workshop looked different now, stronger, with reinforced beams, recessed lighting, and modern ventilation. But he kept a few things the same, deliberately. He repurposed a section of the old workbench, burnished and cracked with age, as the centerpiece of the new interior. He mounted the damaged chisels that had survived the demolition on a shadow board along the far wall. Not for use, but for memory. It wasn't just a workspace anymore. It was a statement. A quiet one, the kind that didn't need an audience. People stopped by sometimes, not with questions or advice, but with presence. Harold came with coffee one morning and stood watching the siding go up, offering no more than a nod. Marvin, who had once stayed silent during Karen's push for demolition, helped carry in boxes of hardware one afternoon and left without asking for thanks. A few of the younger residents, ones who had moved in during the pandemic and barely knew any neighbors, stopped by and asked to see the workshop layout, curious and polite. They didn't talk about what had happened. No one really did anymore. But their visits, their offers of help, and their quiet curiosity spoke for something else, a subtle return of balance. The city sent one final letter in mid-August, confirming that the last of the network reconstruction work had passed inspection. The lines beneath the slab were now up to federal code, protected with smart nodes and monitored for future service anomalies. In an odd way, Brian's property had become safer than most municipal stations. A final report attached to the letter listed his name in a footnote, cooperative witness, primary impacted party. That's all he ever wanted to be. Not the face of some crusade, not the symbol of resistance. Just someone who had been wronged and made it right. He declined several interview requests from local outlets and one from a regional podcast that wanted to do a piece on civic overreach. He had no interest in becoming content. Stories like this didn't need narration, they needed memory. And memory lived best when it wasn't flattened into sound bites. Instead, he turned his attention inward, back to commissions, back to fine wood, back to the satisfying repetition of work done by hand. The shop began to fill again, not with the clamor of power tools but with a steady pulse. Chisels, clamps, the slow draw of sandpaper over walnut, the faint hum of a dust collector. It was the sound of continuity, of something broken made whole again, not perfectly, but authentically. In early September, he received a letter from the city. This one not official, not procedural, but personal. It was signed by 3 council members and simply thanked him for his restraint, his cooperation, and his commitment to lawful resolution. In a time when emotion could have overtaken process, the letter read, "Your choice to trust the system helped us uncover deeper flaws in our own operations. We will be correcting those flaws not just because of policy, but because of you." Brian folded the letter once, placed it in a file with everything else from the past months, and locked it in the cabinet beneath his new drafting desk. And then he moved on. Not forward, not up, just on. Not with triumph or celebration, but with the peace that comes from knowing he had protected something that mattered. Not just wood and walls, but principle. That ownership wasn't conditional. That silence wasn't consent. And that no one, no matter how confident or well-dressed or well-connected, had the right to destroy what they didn't understand. The workshop would outlast all of them. Not because it was built better, but because this time, everyone knew what it stood for.